Looks like time to start. I want to welcome all of you to Labyrinth Books. We wanted to invite everyone to show up for this, and it's really good to see people in person in the bookstore after a long time. Thank you for respecting our safety rules and keeping your masks on. If you're joining us online, you can start asking questions at any time, but don't use the chat that's on the side. Look for the tab at the bottom of the page that says Ask a Question, and we'll be sure to include some of those questions later on in the conversation. I'm Virginia Harabin. I'm the store manager and the book buyer at Labyrinth. It's an honor to celebrate Chris Hedges' new book, Our Class, Trauma and Transformation in an American Prison. Our Class is about a drama class taught in a prison and about the dynamics of teaching and learning about the prison and the people who have to live in it and around it and who are trying to survive its violence and trauma. The play, Caged, was begun there with the full participation of the class and realized in a series of public performances. We hear the voices of the students in this book read over their shoulders as they talk about these great plays by the likes of August Wilson and Amiri Baraka. They work to find their own stories and to have the courage to dramatize them. This book is full of hard stories. It dares every complacency about what this society does to people. On the title page, and I seeded copies of the book around the room, so you should look at this. I want you to look at the book, just grab it. You've got copies all near you. There's a photograph of all the students in the class, and I find it really good to see their faces. Another thing I want to point out when you pick up your copy of Caged, there's, in addition to the wonderful introduction by Boris Franklin, who's on our panel tonight, don't miss the section called Playwrights on the Inside and Playwrights on the Outside as of 2013. They're bios of every one of the playwrights. They're also astonishing little stories. I hope this book will serve as a call to action and that we have time to include these kinds of ideas in the discussion to follow. Tonight, we are so pleased to welcome author Chris Hedges, esteemed journalist, war correspondent, author of many books, and an ordained minister. He's joined by Boris Franklin, playwright, scholar, the first of Chris's former students to earn his degree from Rutgers, currently the assistant director of the New Directions program for prisoners. We're also proud to welcome Russ Owens, who also studied with Chris, a scholar and veteran of New Jersey prisons, and an honored graduate of Rutgers University. Also, another graduate is here, Ron Pierce. Very happy to welcome him as well. Dorothea and I spent some time this afternoon selecting books for this little library around us, and I know we want to be part of helping these scholars rebuild their collections. And just before I came up here, I read the latest piece by my friend Dave Zirin, who wrote this great book, The Kaepernick Effect, among many others. He writes about radical action with such fire and joy. And he gave me something I needed today. He just dropped a piece in The Nation, and I just wanted to share a little bit of that with you today. People depressed about the election and all the other stuff, right? He said, I never thought yesterday that picking up my dog-eared copy of Beloved and reading it in a Northern Virginia coffee shop would count as an act of resistance, but here we are. I do know that here in Virginia and across the country, there are a metric ton of people who either didn't vote or are under 18, and that they're going to turn the lives of the Toni Morrison book burners on their heads as they demand accountability for the past, present, and future. And on that note, let's get going. Please give it up for Boris, Chris, and Russ.
Thanks, Virginia, and thanks to Labyrinth Books, which donated over 700 books to the library at East Jersey State Prison, where my students, and you're about to meet three of my most remarkable students, worked on, and in case of Russ, finished their college degree, summa cum laude. There are several people here, Celia, Jim, Jill, and others, Jennifer, who have been so important in the lives of those who have been demonized and forgotten. So yeah, it's a special night. Boris and Ron were in the class that wrote the play. Ron and Russ were in the class where I traumatized them by dragging them through all of Sheldon Wollin's politics and vision. I've taught, and Russ was not in the class, but I've taught Russ. Russ just got out in July after 32 years. And they've all read the book. Ron and Boris helped edit the book. But I'm just going to set it up and then pass the mic to them, and they can begin to pull out from that experience in the book what they think is salient and important. So I went in to teach this class at East Jersey State Prison through the NJ STEP program, which is run out of Rutgers and allows people on the inside to earn their associates and their BA. And I wanted them to read the great playwrights, Amira Baraka, the Red Dutchman, the great August Wilson, Miguel Pinero, McCraney, others. And it was clear when I got into the class that very few members of the class had much experience with theater and drama. And so just as to get them familiar with dramatic dialogue, because everything in a play, of course, is conveyed through dialogue, I suggested they write scenes as an exercise. What I didn't know is that one of the students in the class, Kabir in Arabic means big, that's his nickname, and he's big, knew who I was listening to because he'd heard me on WBAI, the Pacifica station out of New York, and he'd gone around and recruited the most talented writers in the prison. So when I got those first scenes back, I had 28 students, and I brought them back to Princeton with that kind of musty smell, all handwritten on lined paper that denotes the prison. I ran into several scenes that were just remarkable, lyrical, powerful, and this happened the next week and the week after that. And I said to my wife, Eunice, who is a professional actor, graduate of Juilliard, I showed her this stuff and suggested that maybe I could help the students write a play. And went back to the class and proposed this, that we take these scenes and I would kind of serve as the editor and I would meld some scenes and bring them in. Everything had to be cleared with the class. But it was not premeditated. It was completely organic. And I don't think I or anyone in that classroom was prepared for what happened. Because in prison, you have to build these emotionally protective walls. But when people began to write about their trauma, their suffering, their loss, their grief, those walls melted. And as you can see, these are, that 28 students, they call it the 400 Club, which means they all bench over 400 pounds. Big guys, prison tattoos, standing up there, their hands shaking, in some cases crying. And it just became this explosive experience where everything that poured out and people began to speak about experiences they had that they'd never spoken about in prison. And they'd been sometimes decades, like Lawrence in prison, had been arrested at the age of 14 in Camden, and both of his parents were dead. He was living in an abandoned house as a 12-year-old, dragged into a Camden City police station with 3 detectives. He weighs 90 pounds. He's functionally illiterate, forced to sign a confession. And he's not eligible to go before a parole board until he's 70 years old. convicted as an adult and would still be in prison but for the great Jennifer Soletti, who's sitting in the back. Who got it. All right. But like Boris, Ron, and Russ, he decided that he was just going to be the best person he could be, despite the circumstances in which he found himself. So I taught history class. It was called Conquest. We read Open Veins of Latin America, Bury My Heart, It Wounded Me, and C.L.R. James's classic work, Black Jacobins, on the Haitian independence movement, the only successful slave revolt in human history, and Haiti's been paying for it ever since. And at the end of that class, he was always one of my top students. He waited until everyone left the room, and he said, I know I'm going to die in this prison, but I work as hard as I do because one day I'm going to be a teacher like you, and walked out. And you'll see with these three remarkable men here, the depth of the brilliance and the integrity and the passion, which I've never experienced in any classroom. And I've taught at Princeton and Columbia and all sorts of places. It's sacred space. Because that classroom door closes and you are not a number. You are a human being. And so we developed this play, and it was the revelations that were just unimaginable. I mean, something happened when it was published, although it was 28 collaborators, something happened to everyone in that classroom. Whatever was in the play had happened to someone in that classroom. So there was, I think it was Dollar, locked in a cell in Trenton that first night, and the guards tell him that was the cell that held his father. Or Timmy, I said, well, you write a scene about your mother, something, just a conversation with your mother, and Timmy came up and said, well, what if we're a product of rape? And I said, well, that's what you have to write. And he writes about the phone call from the county jail. He is in a car in Patterson with his half-brother. The car is stopped, searched by police. A weapon is found. It's his half-brother's gun. But Timmy, if no one claims it, then everyone can be charged with a weapons charge. And Timmy takes ownership of it, although it wasn't his. And the conversation from the county jail is, it doesn't matter, Mom. I was never supposed to be here anyway, and you have the son you love. Those are the kind of people that I taught. We eventually put the play together. We couldn't perform it in the prison. There were parts of it that the Department of Corrections would not like, and the retribution would be carried out against my students. We brought in Cornel West and the great theologian James Cone to be our audience. My first student to get out was Boris. He'll tell you I was crying more than his mother at the gate. And Boris and I spent hundreds of hours because when I said who wants a part when we began, there were only 7 students who wanted a part. And as we got into the play, all 28 wanted parts. So we had a play with 28 parts, and we had to consolidate those parts. We worked with Eunice. We worked with the great theater director, Jeff Wise, and Boris and I sat at the computer. It's where I learned what a baby mama was. And it was produced at the Passage Theater to sold-out audiences because in Trenton, the horror of mass incarceration, unfortunately, is quite familiar to those who live in that city. And I'm going to let them pick out some of the, of course, Ron and Boris were in the class, but I'm just going to let them pick out themes that they think we should raise, that were raised in the book.
Okay. I guess if I had to pick out something that was raised in the book, it's in the early pages of the book, and it had to do with the role of art. And to bring art inside of that institution, it brought a little bit of humanity back into the institution, right? Because what we're looking at is what you would call individuals who've been taken out of society, and there's some sort of a violent social death. I believe it was Orlando Patterson who wrote a book on that, right? And so by coming in and doing what Chris was calling taking our songs and bringing them out, he put us in direct dialogue with all of them. He put us back into society in that fashion, right? And we were able to actually tell our stories in that way. So to have that art to be produced and to be brought out into the world puts you in conversation with 28 individuals who are trapped inside of a prison, right? And I thought that was a way of restoring some of the humanity that was taken away when you get a social death where everything is completely controlled by the threat of some sort of violence. You know, so for me as a person who understands art, and it's art throughout the prison. That's one thing that the prison is full of. It's full of art. It's unorganized, it's fragmented, and it's flawed, and it's perfect. That is the kind of art that exists inside of a prison, right? And so when Chris comes in, he said, well, I'm going to teach you guys how to structure this in a form of dramatic dialogue. Now we're having a conversation in the language of a genre, and that gives us a different level of credibility and respect. So for me, that was probably the most important part, and the reason why the conversation is still being carried today.
I think for me, what makes this book, this work important, and we can just start from the name, trauma, transformation. And we all understand what trauma is. You know, it's just something that happens and it seems like it never goes away. And that part, transformation, we understand that transformation is not a singular act, but it's a process. And for me, you hit that right on the head in the book. You know, and for me, you talked about the code. In prison, there's a code for everything. And the code perpetuates being inhuman. You have to stick to the code. You can't show love. You can't show feeling. You can't show emotion. You can't be human. And to go against that could get you hurt, could get you dead. So I thought you captured that very well in how that class pushed back against the code. And I thought that was remarkable, you know, and we can talk about that further as we go on.
And to go with that, because one of the things that I found so fascinating, not only about this book, but about the play Cage, was how it described the humanity of various people. For instance, when he talks about sincere, having in the space he's in, he has to be looked at as a thug, but he's no thug. And when he tries to write it, it comes out to be, you know, like a fanciful TV show, and it doesn't work. It doesn't work in reality. So that to me shows that there's various, and then you have Lawrence, he speaks about, and he spoke about Lawrence earlier, he speaks about him as a child coming up in the system, he having to be an adult. And in Cage itself, we talk about, and this was something that what came to me when we were trying to do the play. There was something missing out of the play when I was out here, and Dr. Cohen started talking about how we couldn't really give depth to the Black prophetic because we didn't understand it. You know, elderly white people do not know the Black prophetic. It's just not prophetic. They're just not there. So it came to me like, but we do know about prison, people in prison that have been in prison over and over from childhood. We call them state raised. And so I came up with the concept that we needed to put somebody that came through the system as a child and worked their way up. And that's where Shaky Brown came from. He was a real person. He's passed now, but it showed in the play the depth of people that no longer have a connection to the outside. When they go to parole, they don't want parole because there's nothing out here. Out here, he was just be another old black man with nothing. When inside, he was Shaky Brown. He was somebody.
You should explain Shaky, what he did and who he was.
Well, Shaky Brown was a blues guitarist. He played the blues in prison all the time, and he developed a narration around life outside so that he could explain his life inside. But the life he narrated from the outside was not real, but it was in his head. It was real. He was this famous blues guitarist. But the first time we got him on stage, he froze. But he developed into it, and he played the blues. I mean, he's self-taught, and he played the blues like you couldn't believe. He was really, really an amazing blues guitarist. But he started out in the juvenile halls, and then he got caught up in another crime, until he got a life sentence. But every time he went before parole, right, he would call them a bunch of racist so-and-sos. We won't get into the semantics, but he would call them out on the nonsense that they were utilizing. So he would always get PED, which in prison is called a hit. But so I couldn't figure this out. So I was talking to somebody that knew him well, and that's what they told me. They said, look, in here, he's Shaky Brown. What's he out there but a 70-year-old black man that has nothing? And so because of the prison culture, you have to go to parole, you have to try to get out. But he didn't want out, so he made sure that he pushed back against them enough that he wouldn't. And so he was a state-raised, what we call a state-raised baby inside the prison system, and he was the picture of it, because a lot of the state raised end up being addicted to drugs, and they have a lot of real issues because of the trauma they endure from childhood to old age, and so we needed him in the play to show the humanity or the taking of humanity, what it means and what it does to somebody, and how it destroys somebody's own humanity to where they don't even want to move, where they could have people that may treat them in a humane way. So that's why I think Shaky was like important to make sure he was in, or that representation was in the play.
So Ron, who through a generous grant worked with me on the book and then was intimately involved in the play. He wasn't in the original class, but he's been so involved in the process. Boris, can you just talk a little bit about what took place in the classroom? It was a remarkable, because people were reticent at the beginning. You were always sitting in the back you had your glasses case like this, and eyeing me, you and Steph. So you have to earn trust in an environment like that. It's not a given.
Yeah, I was skeptical of this guy when he walked into class. I don't know, who's this guy? That's what you say, this guy, right? But in the event, now he did come in and he earned the respect, and that's something that's part of a code sort of inside of an institution, a prison, whereas though everything is built on respect. It's, not many people have different outfits. We all wear the same thing, we all have the same shoes. Respect is a very big thing. So when Chris came in on his first day, he walked in and he started talking to everybody about what he was not going to tolerate inside of a maximum security prison. It's like, okay, you got my respect. He's gangster. But in the event, as it went on, walls started actually coming down. When you talk about breaking a code, there's a certain part of yourself you can express, right? And a lot of guys do express it through art, privately. The conversation is very, very private. You might see someone who has something on their wall with a heart and a picture of their child. They have another inmate draw it or something like that, but it's very, very private. But when we had the class and we were able to go into this sort of dialogue about things that had happened to us and start diving deep into some of that trauma, what came down allowed us to see each other sort of for the first time as a complete person. And then that's why, when we talk about things like what happened with Sincere's transformation, for him to be able to be honest, the dialogue became honest, right? And, and that's one thing, when Chris, when you first came in, you remember you wanted to start the play, and you brought me some stuff that someone had wrote you?
Yeah. You mean the guy from Trenton?
Yeah, I don't know where you're from, but I definitely told him, I said, they wrote this for a white person. They actually wrote this for you. It's not how black people talk when white people aren't around. But the fact that we were able to write that, that it put everyone in an honest dialogue. And then we were able to knock down some of the myths and some of the stereotypes, as to why do people sell drugs, you understand? There's the Shaky Brown who couldn't be explained. Most people wouldn't understand why God wouldn't get out of jail. But through these stories, we were able to communicate that. And it has a resounding effect because here we are, that was 2018. It's 2021, and we're still having this conversation, which means that class did what it was supposed to do. It started a conversation that's still going on, right? And for us to get closer to understanding each other. And through that, we begin to think differently about how we vote on legislation. I mean, it's the gift that keeps on giving, right? So, when I left with a completely new family. Most of us all stay in touch with each other. Some of us work together. I've been to weddings for individuals that I've actually was in that class with. So, it created something different. It taught us how to love in a different way because some of these codes of the prison actually come from the communities that we were actually in before the prison. That don't allow for brotherhood and love to thrive in a way because it can make you extremely vulnerable in a predatory environment, right? So we learned to love and to be brothers in a different way, and it made us better individuals by bringing the class together and having the audacity to say, okay, 28 people that are housed in different spaces are going to write a play together. I mean, I had not known Ron at all in the prison. They called him, do you mind? I want to tell what they called him.
Just don't say what he's got tattooed on his stomach.
They called him Rebel. This guy was, he looked like a hardened biker. Who would have thought we was going to have anything in common? Until we wind up in these spaces and these classes, and then I find out he's brilliant, and I want him on my team in biology because we get points for this guy getting all the answers right. But this is what was doing. You hear the laughter, you feel the love. That's what was happening with us. And that was something that had never happened in a prison. And it made a new society within a society, and now we're matriculated back into society, and hopefully we're making some sort of a difference.
I want to ask about when we produced the play, and Boris took one of the parts in the play, and the part that he played was the old head prisoner, and the scene that he wrote at the end comes out of his own experience in the prison, where he's stopping someone from going into a mess hall to carry out a revenge killing. And he knows he has a homemade knife called a shank, and he wants the shank. And when I watched, for the first time, Boris do it on stage at the theater in Trenton, I noticed that he was very physical. He kept pushing. And I asked him after the play why, and he said, because if I couldn't get him to hand me the shank, I had to start a fight so we would both go to lockdown. And that gets to, I think Jarrell probably articulated, the director out of Chicago best, that at its core, what all of this is about is radical love. And I'm going to ask all of you to address that theme. And we were talking about it before. I'll let you start, Russ, because that radical love is real within the prison.
So I think the best capture it. I'll read an excerpt out the book on page 181, the code. The play was, at its core, about the bonds of loyalty and love. This loyalty and love do not save the characters in the play. The forces arrayed against them are overpowering and lethal. But the repeated acts of self-sacrifice required by loyalty and love keep them human. So when we talk about, first of all, let me say that we had to create a new code. We had to create that love and loyalty in the prison setting because it didn't exist. And that's the first area that we dared to be different. And that radical love is a love that says that I'm going to love at all costs. It doesn't matter. And that's exactly what that situation that happened with Boris, that's what it exemplifies. That radical love, that I'm going to put myself at risk. And this is something that we all learn to do. But it says in the book that it says that this loyalty and love don't save the characters, but it doesn't save any of us. And the real fight, especially for us, and it has always been this, even now that we're out, is to keep reminding ourselves that we're human. Because the prison strips that from you. It strips it from you in every way. And if I was to tell you that even now that I'm home, I still feel the loneliness that I felt when I was in prison. And I can tell you exactly why. Because of the way that they punish, they sew it into your flesh. See, I left the prison, but the prison is in me. The bars, the concrete, is in me. And as me and Boris were saying earlier, he has to remind himself every day that he's free. I have to remind myself every day that I'm free, that I'm human. Because I was so used to not having, so used to not being. And I learned how to love, and I did love, and I would sacrifice myself. But the problem is I still don't know how to receive love.
Yeah, radical love is a person that spends 20 years of his life trying to get college back in the institution to bring hope and transformation to others. That's Tone right there. He spent 20 years of his life pushing back against a system that in 1994 took college out of the prison system because he knew the transformation of it. We were in Trenton together, and there was college classes, but they didn't matriculate to a degree. But these college classes gave somebody hope. And one of the main things about radical love is it will transform your heart. Now Boris had mentioned that my name was Rebel and I was an outlaw biker. And that's true. And back in the day, I came into prison angry, and I had reason to be angry, but I wasn't directing anger properly. I was just angry and directing it at making sure nobody can come into my space and make me more angry for other reasons. So the transformation for me was having somebody believe in me. That's a transformation. That's radical love. Somebody that says, yeah, I don't know him that well, but I know how he runs around this space. I know how he is. And I'm going to make sure that he gets into college, and that was Tone. So that's radical love. You know, that it didn't matter. He comes from Camden, I came from Bayonne. Now, you know, if in the space of prison, where you come from matters. So radical love is somebody taking a chance on somebody. And I try to use it into a language that opportunity, which is what he gave me, opportunities breeds hope. And hope is the spark that ignites the fire of transformation. So radical love in the prison is how we got to be from East Jersey State Prison to East Jersey University. That's how we got to change that space into a space that's for transformation and not a space that's for pain and anger. And you can't show anger, you can't show grief, because you can't put it on your brothers in that same space, because they're dealing with enough on their own.
And I'll add to that very quickly. It's not much more that you can add to that, except for the fact that some Dr. West used to always say, he said the word radical meant that they cut against the grain. It was like a rose of the concrete. It just didn't really necessarily belong there, right? And so when you show that kind of love in the space and make that kind of sacrifice, you know, from the outside looking, a person who says, why would this person that has nothing give up something? Why would this person who's never getting out of jail make sure that another person gets out of jail? I mean, paralegals work effortlessly, tirelessly, trying to help get individuals out. Why would individuals who have nothing coming in return do that? And they do it, that's radical, right? That's radical. They do it just to express their humanity. It's a very, very radical thing to do this day and age, and we should see more of it on this side of the wall than on the other side of the wall, in the conversation. But that's what makes it so radical.
You're good, you're good.
I know lots of stories about these guys. I'm gonna tell one.
I hope it's about you, Boris.
But Russ went into prison and took a vow of nonviolence from the day he went in that prison, which is a very courageous vow to take. He ran a prayer group when people were distressed in my class. At the end of the class, Russ would put his arms around them and they would all pray. I know this from Boris, that if somebody was dejected and alone and rejected in the mess hall, Russ would go and sit next to them and even hold their hand. And Boris said, Russ is the only guy I know who probably won't, he refused to allow the prison culture to define him. And he will get out, and that defiance will save him. And just to talk about radical love and what it means in a physical setting like the prison is that Russ was dealing with the Bloods and trying to get a particular member of the Bloods to come to the prayer services that you had. And the other Bloods said, you bleed in, you bleed out, which meant that if he was going to leave and join that Christian community that Russ was part of, he was going to get a beat down. And Russ went to the Bloods and said, I'll take his place. You beat me down. And of course, in the prison, that is just upends the entire ethos of the prison. And they were so stunned, they didn't. But he walked in and said, beat me down. I've met some of the most remarkable people in my life in prison, and 3 of them are sitting here today. People of tremendous integrity and brilliance. I don't think very many of us could have endured what they endured and become who they have become. And it's, I'm not going to cry. I think there are other teachers here, Jill and Jim and Celia. It's an honor for us. And before we open up to questions, I just want to read a little passage from the end of the book. So this was 2019. It was the graduation ceremony. We had 27 formerly incarcerated students graduated from Rutgers. I was asked to give the commencement address. I am an ordained Presbyterian minister. I very rarely wear a clerical collar, but I put it on for that day because I think that not only that what has transpired, what transpired between us is sacred, but also at its core is what ministry is about. It is about standing in solidarity with the crucified of the earth, as the great James Cone reminded us. And my father was a Presbyterian minister, a great influence on my life, and active in the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement. He was a veteran of World War II, and the gay rights movement at a time when very, very few ministers spoke out. His brother was gay, his youngest brother, my uncle, and my father had a particular sensitivity to the pain of being a gay man in America in the 1950s and 60s. And so I put the clerical collar on, and as I write in the book, I put my father's cufflinks into my shirt with his initials. And just going to give the beginning of this talk is what I told my students, and then we can have questions. And Boris and Ron were there. My fellow college graduates, integrity is not an inherited trait. It is not conferred by privilege or status or wealth. It cannot be bequeathed by elite schools or institutions. It is not a product of birth or race or gender. Integrity is not a pedigree or a brand. Integrity is earned. Integrity is determined not by what we do in life, but what we do with what life gives us. It is what we overcome. Integrity is the ability to affirm our dignity even when the world tells us we are worthless. Integrity is forged in pain and suffering, loss and tragedy. It is forged in the courtrooms where you were sentenced. It is forged in the shackles you were forced to wear. It is forged in the cages where you lived, sometimes for decades. It is forged in the cries of your children, those who lost their mothers or their fathers to the monstrosity of mass incarceration. It is forged in the heartache of your parents, your brothers, your sisters, your spouses, and your partners. Integrity is forged by surmounting the hell around you to study in a cramped and claustrophobic cell for the college degree no one, perhaps not even you, thought you would ever earn. Integrity is to refuse to become a statistic. Integrity is to rise up and shout out to an indifferent universe, I am somebody. And today, no one can deny who you are, what you have achieved, and what you have become. College graduates, men and women of integrity, who held on fiercely to your dignity and your capacity to exert your will and triumphed. So we can take questions if there are any.
So I'm gonna, is this on? Is this on? I don't think, it's on, you can hear me? Yeah, all right. I'm gonna come around with the mic. It's not so obvious to me how we transition to questions. It's such a privilege to be here simply to listen and to be witnesses to your thoughts and your experiences. It's a privilege. So I want to start with a thank you for that. If there are questions in the room, allow me to come to you so that I can hand you the mic. And there's one in the front here.
First of all, thank you all. Very powerful, very moving. You each mentioned how there's a code that you don't go against, and yet to participate in the class, you had to write a new code. You said you had to break that, and I'm curious about the first class and the first person that told their story. What put them over the edge to the point where they could do that? What was that like?
I'll let Boris answer that, but I originally, when they wrote the scenes, they were delivered to me, they weren't read. It was only later that they would get up and be read in front of the class. So I think there was a kind of safety and security in just passing the scene to the professor. But then they would read it, and it was really moving, and if Boris remembers the class, people were complaining that they wanted to get through fences or whatever it was we're reading so people could read, and they would come up. Now, some of the scenes were so emotionally fraught that they couldn't read them. I don't think Timmy read his originally. I mean, when Timmy read it at the performance that we did for Cornell West and James Cone, after he finished, he disappeared. And I asked Boris or someone, where's Timmy? And they said, I think he's in the bathroom. And I found him crumpled in the corner, shaking and sobbing. But it became this remarkable experience where people would get up in front of the class and all of that emotion would pour out as they read, and then the entire class would applaud. But I'll let Boris also address that.
Well, very quickly, what we did is that I don't think anybody really knew we were gonna have to read it publicly in front of the class. It was like a complete trust in whatever the process that Chris was bringing in. So we were taking it as a class. So we went and wrote the scenes and we wrote our papers. And then when he came in, he said, who wrote this scene? And by then, you know, the train had already left the station. It was like, I wrote it. He's like, well, come up and read it. After you read it, then he's like, who wrote this scene? And then the next guy has to come up and do some reading. So that's kind of what tipped it. It's just that he came in after him and his wife went and looked over the scenes and came back with what we thought was good. And we started actually just reading that one.
Thank you.
I'll come in the back and then up here.
Thank you all so much for speaking. It's really meaningful experience. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your decision specifically to teach drama. Why drama as opposed to novels, poetry, other forms of art? And in what ways do you think, in addition to writing the play, how did that influence the class and the kind of conversations you were having and the kind of lessons you were all learning?
So the beauty about the program is that I teach all sorts of stuff. A lot of times when there's holes, I'll fill it, history, philosophy. And I picked plays that addressed the experiences of my students, August Wilson, Baldwin, these kinds of figures, because they were really, a great playwright like Wilson is really writing for them. But they didn't live in an environment, and unfortunately they live in a country where we don't support the arts. They couldn't pay $150 to go see August Wilson. And so all of these writers, Amira Baraka and others, they weren't writing for us. I speak like myself, they were writing for my students. And so I wanted my students to hear their voice. We read Joe Turner, Come and Gone, a wonderful play, the August Wilson cycle. This is, I think, the first, but it's set in a boarding house in Pittsburgh. All his plays are in Pittsburgh. And it's about convict leasing, slavery by another name, worse in some ways than slavery because those who used convicts paid a small fee for them. They weren't actually buying a human being. And so the mortality rate was astronomical. And in that play, it's the character comes up after 7 years of being enslaved as a convict looking for his wife. And he's bitter and he's angry. And the conjurer in the play keeps telling him that he has to find his song. Because the dominant society is never going to tell them who they are, where they came from. They have to go on that search themselves, but they can't be complete human beings until they find their song. And as that play evolved, it became clear to me that this was their song. And that last night of the play, you know, that after Cornell and James Cone came, I had one more class, I think it was Hightower, got up and said, well, you may have all seen last night when Dr. West and Dr. Cone were speaking that I was crying. I've been in this prison system since, what, 1984 or something?
Yeah.
And the night that Dr. West and Dr. Cone came to the prison to speak to us is the only happy night I've ever spent in prison. That was, that last class, you know, I think none of us wanted it to end. It was a sense of mourning, really. But everybody came up and signed the front of the script. And I remember walking out. Come on, I've seen you cry.
Yeah.
I walked out and I had their song, but no one wanted to hear. And because of this guy, we made sure their song was heard. Anyway, you take it.
You answered that, I'm not gonna cry, so. That's why he taught drama, because he's extremely dramatic. Next question.
Okay, we have a question here from our online audience. I just want you to know that there are almost 200 more people who are listening to you online.
Yeah.
And there's a question here from, let me see, Carrie Peretta. I treasure having seen the play at Passage Theater, and it is an honor and joy to hear you tonight. Do any of you continue to write plays, essays, stories as individuals, or might the collaborative experience be especially valuable or unique to your creativity?
Well, I'm still writing,
Good.
and right now I'm actually writing a play that's called Love in the Time of Mass Incarceration, to see, does love survive? With all the coming and the going, the war on drugs, it makes it extremely difficult to maintain some sort of a connection, you know, so it did inspire me to continue to write, you know, and also books as well, so that's a yes.
How about the others?
Well, the only writing I'm doing at the moment is for school. That keeps me well busy writing, you know, but I am, one of my classes is on wrongful convictions. So it is, my aim is always toward changing the whole narrative that's inside and changing the words that everybody uses to dehumanize people that are incarcerated or formerly incarcerated. And so I am also writing, right now, I'm writing a thing for work to try to get people incarcerated the right to vote. And that's what I write. Oh yeah, I forgot, I'm published in, what's the encyclopedia, American Prisons and something. Right now, I'm a little overwhelmed by the story he just told me. And I'm not gonna cry, but that doesn't mean I'm not choked up by it.
Yes, and I myself do plan to write in the future. I particularly plan on writing about trauma. So, I just believe in what Hemingway said, that never write about a thing while you're in it. So right now I'm just waiting, and I'm processing everything around me, and so I can articulate it to where it's most effective to others.
So maybe because we're close to the hour, maybe I can just ask a closing question, just to highlight another dimension of this book, Chris, because the book is also, it also contains some really remarkable reporting about what, Chris, you call the collective crime of American crime, of not just tolerating, but also profiting from the structural poverty, structural racism, and mass incarceration. And there are just wrenching stories in this book about how it is possible that prisoners on their release re-enter the world in debt. That if there's bereavement in their families and they want to go see for the last time the family member that they have lost, that they have to pay the overtime of I think it's four police officers to take them there and wash them while they're there. That you have to pay for the sweatpants that you're going to wear on your release, and on and on. So it used to be, it says in the book, that there was a fund, right, a state fund that would cover some of these expenses. And I want to know, and this returns to Virginia's question of, there are so many calls to action that are kind of tucked in the book. Is there an effort today to reconstitute that fund? What can be done? Where do we focus our energies? Maybe we can end with that.
You ran the rec department, right? I'll let them answer this. There is a fund that's stolen, in essence. The prisoners have to pay into it, and then it's stolen by the DOC. But let me just address that point, because prisons are modern plantations. Slavery, a product of white supremacy, is protean. It changes its shape, but not its essence. And all the work in a prison is done by the incarcerated, who earn about $28 a month in New Jersey. And yet I got a list of commissary prices from 1996 and today, and they're all the salaries that they earn, if you want to call that a salary, 22 cents an hour. It is the same. The prices are all increased by over 100%. And we're talking about basic items, toothpaste, coffee, etc. But then everything internally has become privatized in the American prison system. So the commissary is privatized, the medical is privatized, JPay, money transfer, global tel-link, the phone, RMark, and there's RMark out of Philly, has huge prison contracts throughout the country with constant cases of food poisoning throughout the prison. And when you are sent to prison, you are given fines. So Bell, as a 14-year-old, was given $10,000 worth of fines, and they're pulling about $2 a month out of it, and he finishes prison in debt. If you, as you mentioned, if you wanted to go get that 15 minutes of a viewing with an immediate family member, that's hundreds of dollars. And if you can't pay that back when you get out, then you go right back in. And that's all of the impediments that people face when they get out guarantee the 76% recidivism rate that takes place in this country within 5 years. And so I have taught students who have committed crimes, but I have never taught criminals. There are criminals, those people who orchestrate the poverty. And poverty, as George Bernard Shaw said in Major Barbara, is the greatest of all crimes. There are criminals, Global Tel-Link, RMark, JPay, who are predatory against the most vulnerable. And as Abraham Heschel said, a few are guilty, but all are responsible. And we are all responsible. 1 million people within our prison system work for for-profit corporations, sweatshops, with no right to organize. Nobody is paying into their Social Security account. If they protest the conditions, they're sent to solitary. 80,000 American citizens, as I speak, are in solitary at this moment, a form of torture. So yes, I'm glad that you highlighted that I look at mass incarceration as the civil rights issue of our time.
You're speaking? Well, yeah, the two things. One, they utilize the money that is earned by commissary. Now, commissary is supposed to go into a general fund called the inmate welfare fund, right? The inmate welfare fund is the fund you were talking about. That's what used to pay. When my brother passed in the 90s, they paid for me to go and spend time, and I was in Trent State Prison. I was maximum security. They paid for me to go spend a half hour, and they allowed my family there. When my father passed, right, they made me pay $650 to go from Rahway to Bayonne to sit in a funeral home by myself for 15 minutes. When we got there, they jumped out of the car, they kept me locked, handcuffed, shackled in the back of the car where they checked underneath cars, through bushes. Before they opened the car door for me, they told me, if so much as a motorcycle drives by this funeral home, we're pulling you out of here. And that's what I had to deal with. They told my family, if my family even thought about coming, right, they were gonna not let me there. So that's part of the grieving process. So I had to pay $650 to see my father when he passed, but I didn't get a chance to grieve with my family at all. And so that fund needs to be reinstated, but they need to reinstate every part that was before they started tearing everything down with it.
Well, I will say that, first of all, it's difficult because the way that the prisoners find out about people in their family that have died, it's just, that's not humane. They call you arbitrarily out of the blue. And it's usually an officer that tells you. And it's so cold. But then we've also had services on the inside where we held memorial services for people who couldn't afford to go out there and be with their family. So we on the inside did the best we could to help people that were grieving. But that just goes to speak to what we talked about earlier. And then even coming home, we all heard there's millions of dollars that are for us when we come home, but it never reaches us. It never reaches us. And I just want to tell you that what was told to me when I came home, my parole officer told me, and I want you to keep in mind that you're not a regular citizen.
So, I'll end by saying, I know, Boris, that when you left, the first thing you said to Chris was because you had to leave your library, which at that point were 100 volumes, that you had to rebuild your library. And I just want to end by saying that anyone who has to leave their books inside that you know about and that gets released, Labyrinth is here to replace those books. You just give us the list, okay?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.